ইউ দাও মুড়ি দাও। অনেকদিন খাওয়ানি বলে
সে তখন এখন আর ভালো লাগছে কিছু
গেলাম নিলাম
ওটাকে একটু গরম করবো
বলে দিলাম মাইক্রোফোনকে মুড়ি দাও, মাইক্রোফোন চালিয়ে বলে দিলাম মুড়ি দাও, মাইক্রোফোনটা চালিয়ে বলে দিলাম মুড়ি দাও। দিদি আজ দিদি দিদি আমি অরিন্দম। দিদি আমি অরিন্দম। বলছি দিদি আমি সাবস্থিতি আমি অরিন্দম। সাবস্থিতি আমি অরিন্দম, শোনা যাচ্ছে? হ্যালো 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 হ্যালো। আচ্ছা তুমি আরেকটা থেকে হেডফোন মতো যেটা হচ্ছে না ওইটা এটা ওইখানে আছে।
Madhuri, am I audible?
Yes, you're audible, Shiv.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, you're audible, Shiv.
হ্যালো 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 সাবস্থিতি। হ্যাঁ বলছি ইউটিউব কিন্তু চালু আছে, ঠিক আছে, লাইভ হচ্ছে। ঠিক আছে, আজকে লাইভ কমেন্টও লেখা যাবে, কোনো অসুবিধা নেই। ঠিক আছে।
টেনশন নিয়েই কাটে আমার। হ্যাঁ একটু করে এত বড় ফ্যামিলি সবাই কাটে, তারপর বয়স হচ্ছে, এবার তো সবার রোগ বানবে, সারা জীবনটা টেনশন নিয়েই কাটে। আমরা ছোট, আমাদেরকে সারা জীবন গানা লাগলো হলো।
আমি বেরিয়ে যাবো।
Mokar and Professor Elisabetto Marino speak on The Tempest and Othello. Today we present before you two very eminent speakers from India and abroad. Today we have with us Dr. Nishi Pulugurtha, Associate Professor, Brahmananda Keshav-Chandra College, who is a very well-known figure in the academic circle in India and abroad. And we also have with us Dr. Paramita Dotto from Canada. Both are extremely erudite and well-known speakers, and all of us are eagerly waiting to listen to their talk. So without further delay, I request my colleague and faculty from my department, from Bamunpukur Humayun Kabir Mahavidyalaya.
কোথায় কোথায় বাবা বাবা বলো না বিদেশি কাউকে ডাকবে
Nanda Keshav Chandra College, Kolkata, and has taught postgraduate courses at West Bengal State University, Rabindra Bharati University, and at the Department of Comparative Literature, University of Calcutta. A UGC research fellow at the University of Calcutta, she earned her PhD on Coleridge's poetry. She has completed 3 UGC minor research projects. In Bengali, in the 19th century, on diaspora poetry, and a third on Telugu films and the diaspora. She has been awarded an associateship at the Indian Institute of Advanced Study. Her areas of interest are British Romantic Literature, Indian writing in English, the diaspora, Shakespeare and film. She has presented papers at national and international conferences in India and abroad. Dr. Pulugurtha has published in refereed international and national journals in the Coleridge Bulletin, the Encyclopedia of Post-Colonial Studies, Blackwell Publishing, and Shakespeare and Indian Cinemas, Local Habitations, edited by Poonam Trivedi and Paramita Chakravarti, Routledge, London, 2019, among others. She has a monograph on the Oslo and a collection of travel essays out in the open. She is a creative writer and writes on travel, film, short stories, poetry, and on Alzheimer's disease. Thank you. Over to Professor Madhu Srivastava.
Thank you, Professor Shivnarayan Verma, for the introduction. Now I request Nishiti, yes, please, we are all waiting for you to speak.
Hello.
Yes, you're audible.
Good evening. Yes, thank you. Good evening, and thank you. I would like to thank right at the outset. I would like to thank Madhu Srivastav of Bamunpukur Humayun Kabir Mahavidyalaya and other faculty members of the college and faculty of Mahadevananda for inviting me to speak on this occasion. After yesterday's two speakers and the deliberations, I think the tone has more or less been set for discussions on Shakespeare and on order and disorder and various ways of negotiating Shakespeare. My paper is entitled Shakespeare Adaptations in Indian Cinema. And what I would be doing is I would be discussing a few Shakespeare adaptations in Indian cinema. I have completely omitted Hindi films. I will not be talking about Hindi cinema at all. That is something that most people are very familiar with. But I will be concentrating on Bengali film. I'll be talking about one Marathi film and a Telugu film, all of which are adaptations of Shakespeare's plays. With theatres closed down due to COVID-19, a number of productions of Shakespeare's plays were available online. The Royal Shakespeare Company and the National Theatre, all of which were available, their productions were available on YouTube. In between work and online classes, Shakespeare took up much of my time during the first phase of the lockdown. That is also the time when I managed to watch the 2014 Bengali film Rid Majare, which is Ranjan Ghosh's directorial debut, and Aparna Sen's Arshi Nagar. One of my main interests in watching these, of course, is my interest in Shakespeare adaptations in film. Over the past few decades, global Shakespeare as an emerging field of academic criticism and discourse, and as part of Shakespeare performance, has been the focus of much research and study. The term global Shakespeare, of course, brings to mind Shakespeare's The Globe Theatre as well. The term does have its share of complications in the associations with globalization and possibly cultural homogenization. Hence, in spite of the popularity of the term global Shakespeare that is noticed in conference panels, international festivals, in academic journals which deal with it, this is a term that is often contested by scholars in the field in terms of what it means and whether instead of the word global, we should be using other words like intercultural. I'll just stick to global Shakespeare for this paper. Global Shakespeare refers to a field of adaptations and a critical study that frequently treats its objects of study as centrifugal departures from England to various global locations and centripetal returns. This is a quotation by Lay. Productions that fall into this category exhibit two characteristics. One, they reveal some connection with a setting, that is, the adaptation is located in a setting or in a context which is outside the English or the Anglophone locale and culture. And two, the productions reveal a capacity to move beyond the text of the play. So in other words, they are rooted in particularity and yet still accommodate cultural, linguistic, and performative differences. While it needs to be remembered that these adaptations are by definition very dissimilar to the Shakespearean text, they are often examined and analyzed using the original text, the Shakespearean play. The process of transcultural adaptation of Shakespeare in India brings into contention the idea of Shakespeare's universality across nations, cultures, and time frames. The adaptations of Shakespeare's plays in India, in Indian languages, brings about new ways of looking at the plays and presenting them. The adaptation in a newer, different cultural context works at enhancing the scope of the plays and works towards creating what Salman Rushdie says are, and I quote, the necessary first steps towards changing a world in presenting and recreating a new perspective, unquote. Shakespeare adaptations are either understood as a kind of homage to the original play, where a difference in time and location brings about immediate changes in the way the text is resituated, bringing in various new contexts and subtexts. So, we move beyond Shakespeare and create something so very different and so very new to what is there in Shakespeare, yet at the same time, there are similarities. The interest in Shakespeare in India is, of course, due to the colonial presence in India and the interest in Western education. It is for this reason that Shakespeare has been performed on the Indian stage, has been taught in schools from the 19th century. There have been recitations in various schools in the 19th century. There are lots and lots of accounts of that. There have also been adaptations of the Bard's plays into almost all Indian languages. I will just be referring to film. I'm not going to talk about the other adaptations. The history of Shakespeare adaptations in film and the history of Indian film in general is, of course, due to the Parsi theatre. The Parsi theatre has a very important role to play in the beginning of cinema in India. In this paper, what I would try to do is I'll try to discuss a few films that deal with, that engage with Shakespeare. As I said right at the beginning, they are going to be a few Bengali films, one Marathi film, and one or two Telugu films as well. I purposely left Hindi films out of the purview because most people do have watched the Hindi adaptations and are very familiar with them. All adaptations work within a cultural setup. Film adaptations of literary texts quite often maintain a distance from the original work even while engaging with it. This is important to the idea of adaptation as a cultural process. Shakespeare's plays are a series of texts which include print editions of the text, graphic books, films, and so on. Each of these texts draws on and differs from other texts. Film adaptations expand further on the print versions in that they include dialogue, music, sound, and moving images. The process of transcultural adaptation of Shakespeare in India brings into contention the idea of Shakespeare's universality across nations, cultures, and time frames. As Jose Angel Garcia Landa notes, that Shakespeare film adaptations are unique because, and I quote him, because they have multiple intertextual dimensions connecting them, unlike most adaptations or remakes, to the original text, to previous films of the same play, and to stage productions, which in turn have an intertextual history of their own. So in other words, one of the very important aspects of adaptation is the idea of intertextuality. So the film that you're going to watch, the adaptation will have some reference, possibly to earlier adaptations, possibly to various other films made in other languages which have used the Shakespeare text. The first film that I'm going to discuss in very brief is, of course, Reed Majare, directed by Ranjan Ghosh. Playing on the idea of character is destiny, Reed Majare neatly weaves the story of Obijit and Devjani, who meet each other on a stormy night, fall in love, and are drawn into a vortex of jealousy and suspicion. As the opening credits roll, Shakespeare appears as an image of Shakespeare, that is, because the director acknowledges that this film is an adaptation of Shakespeare's play. What Ranjan Ghosh does in this film is that he incorporates elements from Shakespeare's Othello, Hamlet, Macbeth, and Julius Caesar with great subtlety and finesse. A story about a young mathematics professor, Obijit, who turns into a jealous, indecisive lover, unable to decide what to do, and Devjani, a cardiologist, who is ironically stabbed in the heart and killed as jealousy takes over. The film reveals the way Shakespeare appropriations work in Indian cinema. Incidentally, Reed Majare is a very talked about and discussed film when we come to the arena of global Shakespeares. A face reader right at the beginning of the film warns Obijit to be wary of matters of the heart, which often lead only to destruction, a clear hark to the weird sisters in Macbeth. The first half of the film is set in Kolkata, while the second part shifts to Port Blair. It is here in Port Blair that Obijit is completely overtaken by jealousy that leads to destruction. Reed Majare brings in a wonderful intertextual reference, and this is what I was referring to when I was speaking about adaptation right at the beginning and referring to theories of adaptation, is that there are a lot of intertextual references. In this film, for instance, there's a wonderful intertextual reference to the Othello scene in the Uttam Kumar Suchitra Sen starrer Shoptapudi, and that is the scene that I'm referring to, and the scene that you will find referred to in Reed Majare is the scene of the murder of Desdemona by Othello. Directed by Ajoy Kaur, Shoptapudi features a scene from Othello, the play Othello, enacted on the stage in the film by the lead pair of Uttam Kumar and Suchitra Sen. Incidentally, the dialogues of this scene, which is enacted on stage from Shakespeare's Othello, were delivered not by Uttam Kumar and Suchitra Sen, but by Utpal Dotto and Jennifer Kendall. It's interesting to note that Utpal Dotto performed Shakespeare on the Bengali stage, and similarly, even Jennifer Kendall was very much involved in performing Shakespeare on the stage. I have a small presentation. Maybe I could just show a few pictures. Right. This is Rid Majhare, which I was talking about. Right. And this is the scene from Chaptapodi, the scene where Othello kills Desdemona. This is a very crucial scene in the film, as most of you are aware of. The old man, Abhijit encounters an old man in Port Blair, and this old man reminds one of the soothsayer in Julius Caesar. The old man wants to go home to Bengal and tells Abhijit to do so as well. And the way Abhijit kills this character Devjani is a hark to that scene of Desdemona being killed by Othello. I would like here to refer to some other adaptations of Othello in Indian cinema. The first one that I would refer to is called Ratha Tilagam, which was released in 1963, a Tamil film that is loosely based on the play. Jayaraj's Malayalam film Kaliyattam, 1997, which is a very important adaptation, and of course Omkara, that most of us are aware of, directed by Vishal Bharadwaj in 2006, and Othello. We too have our Othellos, which is an Assamese film directed by Hemanto Kumar Das, a film that adapts the play to comment upon political unrest in Assam. This is Kaliyattam, and this is the poster of the Assamese film Othello. We too have our Othellos. I would now move on to my second example, and this film is Hemanto, which was released in 2016. Directed by Anjan Dotto, Hemanto resituates Shakespeare's story in Kolkata and in the arena of the Bengali film industry. The Kingdom of Denmark here is Agrodut Pictures, a large Kolkata-based film production house. The film begins with Hirok, a journalist, discussing about the mysterious messages, the SMSs, which have been received by Hemanto. Hirok, of course, is the Horatio character in the film, the childhood friend of Hemanto, Hamlet. These messages are the equivalent of the appearance of Hemanto's father's ghost. There is no ghost in this Hamlet, just SMS messages, which when they appear are accompanied by the blurring of lights and voltage fluctuations in the room. These messages are written in riddles and refer to something unnatural related to the death of Hemanto's father, of a wrong done. We even have the line, something wrong in the state of Agrodut. And one of the messages says, hurry home, my son, before it is late. And the messages also talk about the need to take revenge. My murder shall be avenged by thee. Hemanto is an urban hamlet living in New York and is forced to return to Kolkata due to a turn of events. He is forced to leave a fledgling film career in New York of working with big Hollywood names to return and helm affairs at Agrodut Pictures. And that is when he is drawn into a vortex of things that lead to tragedy. The Hemanto we see in New York dopes, listens to alternative rock, and does not come across as clean. He is erratic, wild, and smart. Hemanto, upon his return, is disturbed, impatient, and clueless, unable to decide what to do. On the other hand, we have Hirok, who is calm, composed, and intent on pursuing the legal path. On his arrival in Kolkata, he gets to know that his mother has married his uncle, Kollan Sen, the Claudius character. The occasion is an event to mark the 100 days of a film, which is called Dhangsho, which of course refers to the destruction that is going to come across in the film, a film which is produced by Agrodut Pictures. A sulking Hemanto, lost in thought, characterizes the occasion. Agrodut Pictures is a film production company first owned by Hemanto's granddad that had its heyday in the 1960s. His father took over the company in the 1980s at a time when the quality of mainstream Bengali cinema was on the wane. The urban audiences were turning away from such films, and it was with great difficulty that Agrodut Pictures kept going. From 2009, funds are available for films, their source unknown. And this is something that Hemanto has to later find out, and this is where the conflict comes about. Later, the company does well by producing remakes of Tamil and Telugu films. And of course, this is a reference to the remakes of Telugu and Tamil films that is being done in Bengali films these days. Hemanto is set in 2009. I just refer to a few other Indian languages films which are based on Shakespeare's Hamlet. And the first one that I would refer to is a silent film which was released in 1928. It's a Hindi film called Khoon-e-Nahak, which was based on a very popular stage adaptation by Mehdi Hasan Ehsan. A very important film version of the play, and possibly the first full-length film version, which is an adaptation of Hamlet, is the 1935 Hindi film called Khoon Ka Khoon, directed by Saurabh Modi. There are other adaptations. For instance, in 1936 was released a Tamil film called Manohara, which was based on a Tamil adaptation of Hamlet, which was done by Pamal Sambandam Mudaliyar, and Mudaliyar's translation of Hamlet into Tamil is a very, very important translation. In 1954, we have a Hindi Hamlet. The film is called Hamlet. It is directed by Kishore Sahu, who also acts the role of Hamlet. And what is interesting in this film is that he uses the Shakespearean costume. And this film is a free adaptation of Laurence Olivier's Hamlet. So there are a lot of intertextual references to Olivier's Hamlet. In 1954, we have another film, once again a Tamil film, which has the same name as the earlier film. It's called Manohara. This is directed by L.V. Prasad of the Prasad Laboratories. This film was dubbed into Hindi and Telugu, and it is a remake of the earlier Tamil film. So the 1936 film was remade once again in 1954, and both of them were based on the Tamil adaptation of Hamlet. This remake in 1954 is very much inspired by the legend of Samson and Delilah. There is another English film directed by an Indian, S. Nathan, and this film is called Hamlet, Prince of Denmark. This was released in 2009. There are two other Hamlet adaptations which I will refer to. One is a 2012 Malayalam film called Karma Yogi, and of course the Hindi film released in 2014, Heather, which most of us are aware of. This is Heather is most known to most people have seen Heather and know about it. So I'll just show you a few. This is Hemanto, and if you see, you have the sulky kind of a look with the hero, and at the background you have a lot of computer codes being worked, because the codes are very important in finding out who is responsible for all the trouble, who is responsible for all the reason why the murder has happened, and so on. This is Khoon Ka Khoon, Saurabh Modi's film. I'll just enlarge the scene so that you could possibly have a look at it. This is Saurabh Modi's adaptation of Hamlet. And this is the Hamlet directed by Kishore Sahu. As you can see, the costume is very much Shakespearean out here. This is the 1954 Tamil adaptation of Hamlet directed by L.V. Prasad called Manohara. And these two are the much more recent ones, Karma Yogi, Malayalam 2012, and Heather 2014. Indian cinema, both regional and Bollywood, has seen many adaptations and appropriations of Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet, and this is possibly the play that has been most adapted. Most adaptations have been great box office successes. K. Balachander's Telugu film Maro Charitra 1978, remade into Hindi in 1981 as Ek Duje Ke Liye, is one such adaptation. And of course, there are others like Mansoor Khan's Qayamat Se Qayamat Tak, Manish Tiwari's Isak, Habib Faisal's Isak Zadeh in 2012, and Sanjay Leela Bansali's Bolio Ki Ras Leela Ram Leela 2013, and of course many others in other Indian languages. There's Ambika Pati, which is a Tamil film, 1937, Aparna Sen's Arshi Nogor, and Nagraj Manjule's Sairat 2016. I will be referring to the last two films. There are many other films which have been influenced by Shakespeare's play, and you have a lot of intertextual references. Kayamat Se Kayamat Tak, for instance, has the theme of an honor feud between two Rajput Thakur families, which is not a very uncommon scenario in the Indian ethos. The film has intertextual references to Ek Duje Ke Liye and West Side Story. Maro Charitra and its Hindi remake Ek Duje Ke Liye locate the Romeo and Juliet story within the issue of the differences of language and culture in an Indian setting. The field of Indian Romeo and Juliet adaptations in film provides us with a site for reimagining the conceptual and critical category of adaptation beyond one that relies exclusively on an individual genealogical relationship between original and copy. One of the reasons as to why Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet has so often been adapted and appropriated is, as Lehman says, that it's because of the profound sense of the tragic inevitability that fuels Shakespeare's play. Aparna Sen, speaking as to why she chose the Romeo and Juliet story for a Bengali film, Arshi Nagor, says that Shakespeare's play speaks of, and I quote from her, love in the midst of strife. And she believed that it is only love that can be an antidote to violence and intolerance all around. Arshi Nagor 2015 is a musical with the Montagues as Hindus and the Capulets as Muslims. It uses a lot of rhyming dialogues throughout. Incidentally, Habib Faisal's Isafzadeh also has a Hindu Romeo and a Muslim Juliet. As Shishir Kumar Das notes about Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet, this is what he says. Despite its tragic ending, it provides much closer approximation to the Indian experience of love and passion, social authority, and individual frustration within the rigidities of caste and marriage rules. The twin lovers become a part of the Indian inventory of love legends that include Radha and Krishna, Laila and Majnu, Shireen and Farhad, Heer and Ranjha, Soni and Mahiwal, and of Devdas and Parvati as well. Hailed as the first adaptation of Romeo and Juliet in Bengali film, Aparna Sen's Arshi Nagor literally translates to the town of mirrors, a motif that is present in the film in its aesthetics and music. Mirror images, reflections that bring together distortion, recognition, reflection are present in the film, which is an adaptation of Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet, set in contemporary India, in a town that is called Arshi Nagor. And the name of this name, Arshi Nagor, is of course taken from a Baul song composed by Lalon Fokir, the 19th century singer, who is known for his religious tolerance and pluralism. And this song is Barir Kache Arshi Nagor. Interestingly, the Lalon Fokir reference is very interesting because this is a film where you have communal violence, a lot of communal violence, and where religious differences play a very, very important role. The Mitro, the Montagues, and the Khan Capulet families are competing over a bid that will demolish the Arshi Nagor slum to make way for a shopping mall. Fed up of trying to negotiate some kind of compensation for the slum dwellers, the powers that be set fire to the temple at the center of the slum to ignite communal hatred. The slum burns down. It is hence done away with at no cost, paving the way for the construction of the mall. The first meeting between Julie and Rono takes place at the Khan residence, where preparations are underway for an evening's entertainment. Against her father's wishes, Julie is set to play a man in the evening's production, complete with a turban and mustache. Having heard about the play being put on by the girls of the Khan household, Rono has managed, along with his friends, to enter the house disguised as women in burqas. When they first meet, fall in love, at that instant, Julie is dressed as a young Hindu boy, and Rono has appropriated that of a conservative Muslim woman. This again is seen at the end of the play. The film takes pains to establish that Arshi Nagor is an unspecified location that is at once nowhere and everywhere, not real, but at the same time not unknown. I would move on to another film, which is an adaptation of Romeo and Juliet, a 2016 one, and this is a film called Sai Rath. It's a Marathi film directed by Nagaraj Manjule, And this film was made on a very small budget. However, it became the highest grossing Marathi film till date. This is a love story of a lower caste poor fisherman's son and an upper caste rich politician's daughter. And the caste question is very, very important in the film. Archana Patil Archie, the film protagonist, is a character very rarely encountered in Indian cinema. Sairath gives agency to the woman and brings in notions of gender brilliantly. In a wonderfully nuanced way, the film also brings in issues of caste and class conflict. It also brings into focus honor killings that have been seen in India in recent years. Set in a small village, the film's title Sairat implies freedom, liberation, and could also mean wild and reckless. All meanings are crucial to an understanding of the film and of Archie's character. Sairat reinterprets Shakespeare's story of the star-crossed lovers and presents a hero who is very different from the hero seen in other adaptations of the play in Indian cinema. In an interview, Manjule says that Sairat is his reaction to Bollywood. This story of a fisherman's son and a local politician's daughter, a lower caste boy, Prashant Kale, and Archana Patil, a girl from a rich upper class Maratha family. Both the hero and the heroine, both the protagonists, were played by newcomers, debutantes. Archana is a spoilt daughter, and Parshia, on the other hand, is a fisherman's son who lives on the outskirts of the village, a habitation that demarcates the Dalit lived space from the upper caste neighborhood. Incidentally, this film was remade into Hindi as Dhadak, and Dhadak completely eliminated the caste issue. Dhadak, of course, did not do well at the box office because it was, a stereotypical story of star-crossed lovers. I will move on now to talk about a very old film, but this is a Telugu film, which is called Gunasundari Katha, a black and white film, which was released in 1949. This film adapts the story of King Lear and uses a very popular format of the Janapadam, which is a folk format. The format of Janapadam was very, very popular and was often used to tell an entertaining story. Gunasundari Katha has a narrative that brings together a very indigenous format to frame a Shakespearean text. This intercultural adaptation works as an example of the ease with which Shakespeare can be adapted into diverse textual and cultural media. The film does not use the Shakespearean text throughout. Instead, it moves away from it and focuses on the folk format, leading on to its denouement. It begins with Lord Shiva and his consort Parvati in their celestial abode, and strains of a song wafting up to heaven. It is a song of prayer asking for divine intervention at a moment of crisis. On Parvati's questioning about the lady's plight, Lord Shiva draws attention to the sufferings of a young woman on earth. That is when the film adopts the flashback technique, as Lord Shiva recounts the story of King Ugrasena of Dharanagaram. Incidentally, the mythological was an extremely popular form of films made in Telugu in then undivided Andhra Pradesh. An egotistic king, Ugrasena has three daughters, Rupa Sundari, Hema Sundari, and Guna Sundari. You can understand the Shakespearean reference out here. His wife dies during the birth of the youngest daughter, and the doting king brings up his daughters very lovingly. He doesn't remarry for their sake and neglects the affairs of the state, preferring to look after his daughters. He also says that looking after the daughters is a much more difficult and daunting task than managing the affairs of the state. The three girls are trained in the best possible way. Even during their childhood, the elder two are more interested in material things and do not like the younger sister. The youngest is of a quieter temperament and is very loyal to her father. She loves reading stories about dedicated wives. And in the film, we see the young girl reading a book which is called Pativrata Kathalahari, which are stories about women like Sita, Sati, Savitri, and so on. This interest possibly prepares the audience for the answer that she gives to her father's questioning about how much she loves him, something that the original play did not have. I just refer to one other film, and this film is called Yellamma. It's a Telugu film set in 1850s. I'll just briefly refer to it because I have till now I have not been able to get the film, because unfortunately this film did not have a public release, so it's not possible to get this film anywhere. But it is a very interesting story from the stills and from what I have read about it elsewhere, because this particular film Yellamma relocates Shakespeare's Macbeth from 10th century Scotland to mid 19th century Telangana. It talks about ambition, achievement, and unfulfilled dreams. And it speaks about characters who are drawn into a whirlpool of ambition, deceit, and bloody revenge. Michael Purcell argues that, and I quote, cinematic adaptation is necessarily a blend of the verbal and the visual, the ultimate aim being the integration of the visual realization with the text so that each supports and enriches the other. Film adaptations and appropriations work on plays to create new texts and new ways of looking at and presenting Shakespeare. I would like to refer to Julie Sanders, who notes that adaptations work to make text relevant by, as she says, approximation, an updating, and a transposition that takes a text from one genre and delivers it to new audiences in cultural, geographical, and temporal terms. Adaptations, Julie Sanders notes, and I quote, signals a relationship with an informing source text or original, a specific version, albeit achieved in alternative temporal and generic modes, of that seminal cultural text, unquote. Appropriation is a little bit different because, in comparison to adaptation, appropriation has a far greater distance from the text. And the intertextual relationship between the text and original text and the performative one is much less explicit and embedded. In the particular case of Shakespeare on film, in his non-Anglophone, non-English manifestation, the adaptations that we get to see, we are invited to be responsive to other verbal registers, to new narrative strategies, to new emotional contours. These elements recall the plays, but not exactly as we have read it, meaning that we don't concentrate much on issues of nomenclature, but we concentrate on how the categories of the Shakespearean are mobilized. Adaptation studies asks us to reflect on the extent to which Shakespeare is variously explained, Shakespeare is variously intertextualized in terms of cultural and economic capital. The category of adaptation is therefore infinitely more complex, comprising multiple sources or intertext and multiple avenues or modes of transformation, intertextual references to other Shakespeare film adaptations. Ultimately, what the film offers us is not just an alternative iteration of Shakespeare's plays, but in its rich experimentation, a novel approach to the genre of adaptation itself. I would like to end with this quotation with what Paramita Chakraborty says, and in this work, Shakespeare and Indian Cinemas, in her essay, in her essay on King Last Lear, and she speaks about the recent Bengali adaptations of plays, and I think what she says with reference to the recent Bengali adaptations of the plays on screen applies to all recent adaptations of Shakespeare in India in all languages. And this is what she says, and I will end with it. She says, and I quote, Shakespeare is not a signifier of a culture or identity, but merely a resource to be used to narrate the story of millennial Kolkata. Of course, she's referring to Bengali films and its denizens. Shakespeare, she notes, provides a medium for articulation of local identities, and paradoxically, it is through these increasing forms of localization that Shakespeare's universality thrives. I'll just show a few more slides which I have, and I end with that. Right, this is Arshi Nagur. This is the poster of Arshi Nagur. Right. And this is Sairat. It's a brilliant adaptation and a lot of intertextual references as well. It's available on YouTube and in Netflix, and there are subtitles. So in case anybody is interested, you can always watch the film. As a film, it's very good even. This is Gunasundari Katha, the 1949 Telugu film, which adapts one particular part of King Lear. And that is it. Thank you.
Thank you, Nishidi, for this wonderful and engaging talk on. You referred to so many films. I had never heard of many of them. Obviously we are having questions. Questions are pouring in. And now I invite Professor Ashish Vishwas from the Department of English, Mamun Pukur Humayun Kabir Mahavidyalaya, to take over the question and answer session. Ashish, are you there?
Am I audible?
Yes.
Thank you, Madhuji, and thank you very much, Nishidi, for giving us a wonderful session filled with information and knowledge on Shakespeare's adaptation in Indian films. We have a few questions. The first of those questions are Professor Subhashish Sandhuka asked, in reference to the Indian adaptations, would you say that the gender roles of the Shakespearean characters get subverted in many occasions due to cultural impact, or they remain intact?
Could you repeat the question, please?
Definitely. In reference to the Indian adaptations, would you say that the gender roles of the Shakespearean characters get subverted in many occasions due to the cultural impact, or they remain intact? This is the question from Subhashish Chandra.
No, they don't remain intact because the director is adapting the Shakespearean story to a different cultural linguistic milieu. He is changing a lot. He is retaining quite a bit from Shakespeare, but he's bringing about a lot of change. So there are a lot of changes that are being done to the gender roles as well. There are a lot of changes that are being done to the very way in which the characters are being presented. If you have seen the Hindi ones, you would note there, and yes, there are a lot of changes because, as I said, this is a completely different process that the director is indulging in. So there are lots and lots of changes, not just with all the gender roles. Yes, lots of changes that are being done.
Okay, I think the question is answered. Now, the next question is from one of our members from organizing committee and one of the faculty member of our college, Professor Shivnarayan Verma. He asked, do you find any parallelism in regards with Cateism in Sairat with that of in Romeo and Juliet?
Parallelism between?
Parallelism in regards with casteism in Shoirot with that of Romeo and Juliet.
See, Romeo and Juliet talks about a family feud. So you need a feud if you're going to have, if you're going to adapt the Romeo and Juliet story to any other context. You need to have two warring families, right? So what Sairat does is that he brings caste into the question. So he makes these two families, one an upper caste and one a Dalit family. So obviously, given the Indian context, there is going to be a lot of discrimination between the two. There are going to be a lot of differences, and you get to see that in the film, where when there's a particular scene when Archie, she drives a tractor and goes off to look for Parshia. She goes off to his house, and you notice that his house is set beyond the village. Bittergaon is the name of the place where the entire story takes place, and Parshia's house is located outside the village because it is a Dalit neighborhood. And Manjule wants to bring in the Dalit question, and it is because it talks about this that the film works wonderfully. If you have seen Dhadak, which is a remake of Sairat, Dhadak fared very badly at the box office. Dhadak completely removed the caste question. And Sairat deals with it beautifully. And the end of the film, it's a very, very disturbing end of the film where the honor killings were caste, which is so much a part of Indian society, even today, where there's so much of discrimination based on caste, is brought to the fore. Caste is not there in Romeo and Juliet. They're just two, feuding families. You don't have caste elsewhere. You could have possibly race, but not caste. But in the Indian context, the caste works in locating the film.
Okay, thank you. The next question is from our very own Shravasti. She asks, characters in Indian Shakespeare adaptations are generally stereotypically Indian. How much does that take away from the individualistic streak of every original Shakespearean character?
See, actually, that's a problem that I referred to that at the beginning, where when we look at these adaptations, we kind of compare them with the original play. But you see, the adaptation is a completely different text in itself. Right. There will be a little bit of similarities with the character, with the Shakespearean characters, but otherwise, this character is in a completely different time, completely different locale, and not all these characters that you find in the Shakespeare adaptations are all stereotypes. Because I could give you one example where you don't have a typical stereotypical Indian character, and that is the film Sairat, because this character of Romeo there, that is Partia, he is not the hero that you would think him to be. Right? He's a very simple, down to earth, very unheroic kind of a character, almost like the common man that you meet outside. So it's interesting to note how filmmakers are trying new ways and means to engage with the text and not present very stereotypical characters. I mean, I don't think even Maqbool is a very stereotypical Indian character as well. I mean, if that answers your question.
Oh, thank you, thank you. The next question is from Devopriya Paul sir. He asked, was there any Indian adaptations of Measure for Measure?
No, I have not come across any Indian adaptations. I mean, I have not watched any Indian adaptations of Measure for Measure. Most of the films, there's just one Indian adaptation supposedly of Measure for Measure, which I have not seen, which is a 1940 film directed by Rustam Modi, which is an Urdu Hindi film, but I have not come across the film. I have not seen that film. That's the only reference that I have found about Measure for Measure.
Thank you. The next question is from Madhu Srivastav, one of the co-conveners of the organizing committee of today's program. She asked, what would be your take on the ending of Haider, end of Haider's mothers? Though you have not spoken, obviously, please ask, give me the, please could you answer please that question? I'm repeating the question.
That is an interesting ending. There has been a lot of discussion about that particular ending because the ending talks about the end of violence if it could possibly be done, and it talks about violence in a very violent setting, Kashmir. Yes, I have not spoken about the Hindi ones purposely because most people are very familiar with the Hindi adaptations of Shakespeare. So I purposely left them out of my discussion. I didn't want to speak about them at all. But yes, Haider, the ending is very interesting because the Gertrude character, unlike the one in Shakespeare, the Gertrude character is there at the end where she's, trying to take responsibility in some way for what has happened and trying to, kind of want to bring an end to the violence, which is so much a part of the world and of that particular setting and also of the world that we are part of.
Our next question is from Shatvik Gupta. The question is, when adapting a Shakespearean play in an entirely different culture milieu, how much creative liberty in terms of plot and character is offered to the adapter?
Since it's an adaptation, it's a different text altogether. So it is the director and the it's up to him absolutely how much of Shakespeare he wants to take. There are people who acknowledge the influence of Shakespeare. Aparna Sen does that. Ranjan Ghosh does that. There are people you have Vishal Bharadwaj does that. They acknowledge the reference, their indebtedness to Shakespeare's plays. But the director has immense amount of liberty when he's adapting, when he's making an adaptation. Immense amount, because he's changing the location, he's changing the time, he's changing the language, he's changing the cultural milieu completely. So he has ample, and that is what is interesting. I think that in spite of the fact that you take out the plays from their context, from the time that Shakespeare writes, and bring them and present them, in a very, very different context, culturally, linguistically, and yet it seems it works. I mean, you think of Maqbool, which is a film which most people have seen, and it works so brilliantly, right? Even the transposition of the witches into those characters of Pandit, even that works so very brilliantly. So I think it speaks about the universality, in spite of everything, it still works brilliantly.
Okay, thank you. Our next question is from one of the member of the organizing committee, that is Rizal Mullah. He asked whether Bhranti Bilas is an Vidyasagar's adaptation or Shakespearean adaptation.
Bhranti Bilas is an adaptation of Shakespeare's Comedy of Errors. It's a prose adaptation which Vidyasagar did. It's a prose adaptation of, and it's a very, very important. I did not refer to that as well because most people know it. I wanted to concentrate on text which most people are not familiar with. But Bhranti Bilas is an adaptation by Vidyasagar of the Comedy of Errors. And you see, even the Comedy of Errors is actually, when Shakespeare was writing that, he was going back to the Latin comedy. So it's interesting to see how it is transposed over a period of time. Yes, Bhranti Bilas, you also have the Hindi film Angur, which I have not referred, Gulzar's Angur, which once again uses the Comedy of Error story. And Angur is a wonderful film as well, and a very good adaptation of Shakespeare as well.
Okay. Our next question is from Madhu Srivastav, Professor Madhu Srivastav. He asked, how did the use of Shakespearean costume help in the film you referred to?
Excepting Kishore Sahu's Hamlet, no one else uses the Shakespearean costume, because even Saurabh Modi, of course, uses that to some extent, but everybody else, since we are relocating the play in a different cultural, in a different geographical context. So they're completely, just as they're adapting the story, various scenes, various events, they are adapting. Many of the films, you will find verbal echoes of Shakespeare's plays. When you watch Maro Charitra or Ek Duje Ke Liye, there are specific lines from Shakespeare's plays which are, translated almost verbatim and presented. But with the characters, with the costume, no. The director is at a liberty. It depends upon where he is locating his story.
Okay, thank you. Then there is a question from Raj Yashri Goswami. Is there any adaptation on the Fools of Shakespeare?
The Telugu film which I referred to, Gunasundari Katha, there is no fool in the film as such. But there is one character in the film who comes into the film at a point of time when, Lear is angry with the younger daughter because she doesn't want to give in to the kind of answer that he wants. And so he decides, he's so angry with her that he decides to completely send her off. And he gets her married to a blind beggar, a blind and lame beggar. Right? And that is from where the story actually moves into the folk format. This particular character in this film, Gunasundari Katha, reworks. It's not exactly the fool character in King Lear, but there are a number of elements which the director takes of Shakespeare's fool, and you find a number of those elements in this character. It's called Daivadinam, right? Meaning the poorest of poor characters, and you have a number of the fool elements in this character. Right. So it depends on what the director is doing, what he has in mind, what his vision is, how he wants to present his story. And you may not have the full figure at all if it is not important to him. I also did not refer to other films. So there's Zulfikar by, I forget the name of the director. Um, and Zulfikar uses both Antony and Cleopatra and Julius Caesar as well. So there are many, I have not referred to all of them, but there are many, many films which use Shakespeare. I was talking about intertextual thing. I was talking about references to other films. In Arshi Nagar, for instance, you will have, though it is set in contemporary India, the heroine, she's a young girl, she has a tattoo on her back. And this tattoo on her back actually is an intertextual reference to Baz Luhrmann's Romeo plus Juliet. Right. The gang wars that you have in the film is once again a reference to the gang wars that you have in the West Side Story, which is once again a reworking of the Romeo and Juliet story. So you have such things throughout, and as you watch, I mean, if you're watching it with, through you're watching it as a text to, yeah, Srijit Mukherjee. Thank you. Somebody mentions the director's name. I was thinking of Srijit Mukherjee. Thank you. So as you watch these adaptations, you will find loads and loads of such references. For instance, in the Romeo and Juliet thing, that inevitability of tragedy that is there, and that you see in a number of adaptations. You will have the setting sun motif constantly being presented, whether it is Ek Duje Ke Liye or the Telugu one Maro Charitra, or whether it is Kayamat Se Kayamat Tak. So the director is at liberty to, because he's not he's presenting an adaptation, he's recreating it in another completely different medium, and he's trying to present it in a context which is completely very far removed from Shakespeare's England. I hope I've answered the
Thank you, Ms.
questions.
Nisi. Our probably today is the last question probably. Shivnaran Verma asks, would you say something about the movie She's the Man adaptation of the 12th Man?
I haven't seen that, unfortunately. Sorry about it. I haven't watched it.
Okay, no problem. So that's all. I think all the questions are perfectly met by Nishidi. So thank you, Nishidi. Over to Manu Srivastav for some of the questions.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Ashish, and thank you, Nishidi. It's always a pleasure to listen to you. And
Thank you so much.
yeah, this lecture has opened up so many avenues. I personally came to know about a lot of films I had not even heard of. I'll try to see them if available. And thank you once again on behalf of the organizing committee of both the colleges.
Thank you so much.
It's a pleasure having you here. And I must say, we are in very good time. And so once again, I request Ashish Vishwas, Faculty, Department of English, Bamun Kapoor, Humayun Kabir Mahavidyalaya, Professor Ashish Vishwas, please do the honors and introduce our next speaker, Dr. Paramita Dr. De. So over to Ashish.
Thank you, Madhuji. So now I have the honor to introduce our next eminent speaker, Dr. Paramita Dr. De. She is currently based in Toronto, Canada, where she has been living for the last 2 years. She has a wide range of pedagogical and research interests ranging from Shakespeare studies, teaching in English as a second language, um, teaching as a second language to language assessment. Currently, she is working as a certified examiner of the Canadian English Language Proficiency Index program at Paragon Testing Enterprises, a subsidiary company of the University of British Columbia in Canada. She has also trained in and received accreditation for teaching English as a second language from TESL Ontario and TESL Canada. In 2019, she taught Shakespeare and performance at Ryerson University, Canada, and also worked on the research project Lexicon of Early Modern English in the Department of English at the University of Toronto, Canada, under the supervision of Professor Ian Lancashire. She did her MPhil and PhD from Jadavpur University, India, on Shakespeare and the drama of early modern English England, respectively. She has presented papers on Shakespeare studies widely, such as at the Shakespeare Association of America conference in April 2020, Stanford Shakespeare Theatre Conference in Canada in June 2019, Indian Shakespeare's on-screen conference in London, United Kingdom in April 2016, Shakespeare Society of India International Conference in October 2016, and even organized and led a seminar at the Biennial International Conference of Asian Shakespeare Association in December 2016, to name only few. In India, she began her career in higher education sector as assistant professor of English in West Bengal Educational Service, where she was posted at Chandannagar Government College for more than 6 years. In her last role, before relocating to Canada, she was assistant professor and head of the Department of English at Ram Mohan College, affiliated to State University of Calcutta. She has also taught English literature at the postgraduate level in Lady Brabourne College, Maulana Azad College, St. Paul College, Kolkata as guest faculty. Her international publications include an article on Shakespearewala in Performing Shakespeare in India, published by Sage in 2016, Tagore's Biday Abhishap in Politics of and Reception of Rabindranath Tagore's drama, published by Routledge in 2015, and a short story titled The First Time in the collection Emanations, published by international authors in 2015. She is a life member of the Shakespeare Society of India, member of Shakespeare Association of America, Modern Language Association, Asian Shakespeare Association, TESL Ontario, and TESL Canada. That's all. Over to you, Malini.
Yeah, warm welcome to Paramita Dr. Dey. We are all waiting to listen to you, so you may begin.
Yes. Good evening, everyone in India, and good morning to anybody who might be watching from my time zone. I would first like to begin by thanking the organizers, Professor Madhu Srivastav and Professor Shomi Shen Mitro, for inviting me to this webinar, and also thank everyone who is attending this event live. It gives me great pleasure to share the same virtual space with Professor Nishi Pulugurtha, with whom I go back a long way, and thank you for presenting such a fantastic paper. The topic that I will speak on today is Fair is Foul and Foul is Fair, the supernatural order in Macbeth. So I will be presenting a slide, and just do let me know if you can see it. Can you see it?
Yes, we can see.
Thank you. 1 second. I just adjust my screen. Just give me a moment. Can everybody see?
Yes, it's visible.
Okay, thank you so much. So we all know that Macbeth is one dark play of Shakespeare that deals with the consequences of the violation of the great chain of being, or the hierarchical order of beings, which included everything from God and angels at the top, to humans, to animals, to plants, to rocks and minerals at the bottom. The theory started with the Greek philosophers Aristotle and Plato, but was a basic assumption of life in Elizabethan England. The great chain of being is a major influence on Shakespeare's Macbeth. Macbeth disturbs the natural order of things by murdering King Duncan and usurping his throne. This violation of order throws all of nature into uproar, and we hear a story related by an old man that the horses in their stables went mad and ate each other after the king's murder, which is a symbol of unnatural happenings. And at the same time, many critics over the ages have infantilized the otherwise valorous Macbeth and squarely placed the entire responsibility of his violating the order in the world of the play and his tragic downfall to the witches and Lady Macbeth, who have been accused of manipulating him to treason and murder. With its thunder and lightning and its three witches speaking in riddling rhyme, Macbeth clearly marks a new departure and visibly sets out to depict a world apart from the very human worlds that have dominated Othello and King Lear. But it is not clear through the reading of the play that the entire responsibility for the wicked deeds of Macbeth falls solely on the witches. It is true that Macbeth is first presented to us through the witch's speech, rather than the other way around. And both we and the witches know that they will meet Macbeth before he knows it. Thus, when his first line, "So foul and fair a day I have not seen," in Act 1, Scene 3, echoes the lines the witches chant in unison to close the first scene, "Fair is foul and foul is fair, hover through the fog and filthy air." The effect, as Brittany Marler says, is to position Macbeth within the framework of the witches' world. Nonetheless, in my talk, I would like to look at the supernatural order in Macbeth, focusing on the witches to put forward my contention that Shakespeare's representation of the supernatural in this play is too equivocal and complicated, where the fair is indistinguishable from the foul, to be actually held completely accountable for the tragedy that ambitious Macbeth brings upon himself by violating the divine order through regicide. Before I move on to discuss the witches, I would like to remind you that the main source of Macbeth, Raphael Holinshed's Chronicles of England, Scotland, and Ireland, contained the original story of the prophecies of the witches, so they were not actually invented by Shakespeare. However, Shakespeare was not a plagiarist, and his portrayal and the representation of the witches is unique and abstruse at the same time. So what are these ambiguities when it comes to the representation of the witches? One is the question of authorship. Second, their nomenclature. Third, their appearance and gender. Fourth, their actual status, whether they are supernatural or mythological beings, and what is the difference between the two, because the layman might often try and conflate these terms. And last but not least, their role, the nature and extent of their evil. Let's begin by talking of authorship, a perennial problem when it comes to Shakespeare's plays. The play, as we know, was written around 1606. The younger contemporary of Shakespeare, the playwright Thomas Middleton, is thought to have interpolated the songs related to the witches, "Come Away Hecate" in Act 3, Scene 5, and "Black Spirits" in Act 4, Scene 1, around 1609 to 1610. This is because both songs appear in Macbeth and Middleton's later play The Witch, whereas the first folio of 1623, where Macbeth was first published, does not provide the full text of the songs and only the first lines. Some scholars even go as far as to suggest that Middleton rewrote Shakespeare's Weird Sisters as the bearded hags we know today, contrasting the 1623 text with Simon Forman's personal account of a 1611 performance of the play at Globe, where he described them as three women fairies or nymphs. So this ambiguity as to who was the author of the scenes of the witches, Shakespeare or Middleton, would naturally affect our interpretations of how Shakespeare, if at all, wanted to portray the witches in Macbeth. The next ambiguity is in the nomenclature. In Act 1, Scene 3, the first witch recounts her encounter with the sailor's wife and says, "A sailor's wife had chestnuts in her lap and munched and munched and munched. 'Give me,' quoth I, 'Erind the witch,' the rump-fed Runyon cries." And then the witch continues with her story. What is important for us to note here is that this is the only line in the play where the term witch is used in dialogue for one of these characters, whereas elsewhere they are referred to as weird sisters. The stage directions, again interpolated by later scholars, however, refer to them as witches. Why this difference in nomenclature between witches and weird sisters is significant, we will find out in a few moments from now, after we discuss the ambiguity in appearance and gender of these characters. For this, I will direct you to Banquo's response after he and Macbeth first meet the witches on their way back from the war in Act 1, Scene 3. Banquo says, "What are these so withered and so wild in their attire, that look not like the inhabitants of the earth, and yet are on it? Live you, or are you aught that man may question? You seem to understand me, by each at once her choppy finger laying upon her skinny lips. You should be women, and yet your beards forbid me to interpret that you are so." I have highlighted those two parts of his speech where he's questioning whether they are natural or supernatural characters, and then wondering whether they are men or women. This reinforces their ambiguity, and they remain an enigma. And that is why filmmakers in their adaptations of Macbeth can depict the witches in such diverse ways. We have Akira Kurosawa in The Throne of Blood depicting the witches as one old woman spinning a wheel and finally disappearing into thin air, which would make her very supernatural. And our very own Vishal Bharadwaj depicted the witches as two men police officers, Nasiruddin Shah and Om Puri, who were extremely corrupt but not supernatural. Banquo continues mystified by the appearance of these strange beings. In the name of truth, are ye fantastical, or that indeed which outwardly ye show? I would like to draw your attention to the terms fantastical and outwardly ye show, and at this point refer to Stephen Greenblatt, who rightly says that Banquo is not only doubting their gender, which is raised by their equivocal appearance, but also doubting whether they at all have an objective existence outside the imaginings of the mind, and about what kind of existence that is, natural or supernatural. With this, we will come to the question of whether they are supernatural or mythological beings, an issue which is irrevocably bound up with the ambivalence of their nomenclature, of being witches as opposed to weird sisters, as mentioned sometime before. If you look at the meaning of weird sisters, the term that these creatures are referred throughout in Macbeth, except in one dialogue in Act 1 as already discussed, the Webster's New World Dictionary, 3rd College edition of 1515, describes them to be the three fates. A minor source of the play, the original Chronicle of Andrew of Winton of 1420, describes this story to be that of the tale of Macbeth and the three weird sisters, where these creatures are actually part of the Scottish dreamscape, dreamt by the protagonist, have absolutely no connotation of evil, and whose function is prognostication, where they appear as special seers or fates who can see and tell the future. Moreover, the term weeds or weirds also refer to the three Anglo-Saxon fates, who are three sisters who weave the destiny of man. The main source of the play, Raphael Holinshed, in his Chronicles of England, Scotland, and Ireland of 1577, too calls these women either the weird sisters, that is, the goddesses of destiny, or else some nymphs or fairies endued with knowledge of prophecy by their necromantical science, by which he categorically locates them as mythological beings and not as supernatural creatures such as witches. Matthew Ginn's Latin entertainment, Tres Sibyllae, or the Three Sibyls, written 1 year before Macbeth was penned in 1606, refers to these creatures as prophetic sisters who are sibyls, which would again place them in the domain of mythological beings and not witches. Simon Forman, who attended the 1611 performance of Macbeth at the Globe, refers to these creatures as women fairies or nymphs in his diary, the book of plays and notes thereof, performance for common policy. So, what is important to note here is that these characters are still not perceived as witches even 5 years after their first performance in 1606. This distinction between witches and weird sisters matters because if we call these dubious creatures weird sisters, then they are akin to goddesses, nymphs, fairies, who may under some circumstances be fear provoking, but yet are different from witches. It is important to remember that goddesses, nymphs, and fairies are subcategorizations of deities, and hence this would make them mythological features. However, a witch is never a deity. A witch is a mortal woman with supernatural powers. So, how we name them is very significant to what we perceive their status to be. If weird sisters, then they are mythological without any connotation of evil, and if witches, then they are supernatural and maybe evil. By referring to them both as weird sisters and witches, Shakespeare does not offer any single interpretation of who and what they are. Fair is foul, and foul is fair. It will be useful at this point to discuss how and why this transformation from weird sisters to witch might have taken place. Before writing of Shakespeare's Macbeth, the weird sisters were not perceived as witches per se. Yet, the first folio text of the play, from the opening scene, develops them as witches with their attendant familiars, which are the small animals kept as a witch's attendant, given to her by the devil or inherited from another witch. The familiar was actually a low-ranking demon that assumed any animal shape, such as a toad, dog, insect, or black cat. In this play, these figures have Grimalkin the cat and Paddock the toad with them, who can be thought of as their familiars. Their transformation from mythological figures to witches took place under the influence of King James I of England and his anti-witchcraft treatise, Demonology, published around 1596 to 1597, when he was then the King James VI of Scotland, which he had written in response to Reginald Scott's The Discovery of Witchcraft, published in 1584, a book which had denied and refuted the existence of witches. James I publicly opposed witches, denounced prophecy and the art of necromancy as related to witchcraft. He launched the witch craze post the North Berwick trial in Scotland, which led to the persecution of thousands. I don't know if you can see clearly the pamphlet which I have put here, the pictures. It's a pamphlet, News from Scotland, which actually depicts some of these witch trials and the witch craze that was happening at that time. In 1590, when King James, who was then the King James VI of Scotland, and had not yet become the King of England, presided over a witchcraft trial called the North Berwick trial in Scotland. He became personally involved in this particular trial because he believed that Francis Stuart, 5th Earl of Bothwell, had plotted with a coven of witches to bring about his destruction. This was related to his wedding with Queen Anne of Denmark. While sailing to Scotland to marry James, Anne of Denmark's ship had met with trouble, and James had gone to rescue her. On their return, their ship had nearly been capsized in the stormy seas. This was said to have happened while a coven of witches gathered on Aldkirk Green in North Berwick. A confession from a schoolmaster named John Fian implicated Bothwell. This was enough to convince James that there had been a supernatural plot to raise a storm and kill him and his bride-to-be. It seemed that the devil himself wanted the king dead. However, Fian's confession was extracted under torture. When he finally faced execution, he recanted. This very high-profile trial reinforced the existing anti-witch sentiments of the time. This background is important for us to know, as Macbeth was written in honor of King James, to glorify his political stances and causes, and further the Stuart myth, which is the myth of the Stuart kings of Scotland and England, whereby their own propaganda, they are presented as the divinely appointed rulers of all of Britain. An apparition that Macbeth sees in Act 4, Scene 1 of the play indicates that Macbeth's line stretches all the way to King James VI of Scotland, who became King James I of England during Shakespeare's lifetime in 1603. This North Berwick trial also sparked a wave of similar witch trials throughout Scotland in the 16th and 17th centuries. At least 3,837 people were accused of witchcraft. Many of these were tortured, and up to 70% were put to death. The torture devices used for these women were breast rippers. Yes, you heard me correct, breast rippers. The scold's bridle, and women were also burned at the stake. According to Diane Purvis, however, in England at least, where we also had these witch trials, the women who were accused of being witches were mostly hanged. Small consolation. The suspects would be aged, poor, or helpless women, such as midwives, women with birthmarks, which was thought to be the devil's mark, and left-handed women who were thought to be extremely sinister. The laws against witchcraft were punitive in King James's reign and entailed death sentence by hanging or burning alive. In all reality, female witches were scapegoats in English and Scottish culture. It is said that 100,000 persons were executed for witchcraft in Europe between 1400 and 1800. The way to determine a woman to be a witch was pretty straightforward. She would be either thrown from a cliff into the abyss or tied to a ducking stool and pushed in a pond. If she didn't die, she was obviously a witch and would then need to be executed. And if she did die, which was mostly the case, then at least she was proved to be innocent and not a witch. We now move on to discuss the final point about the ambiguous nature of the witches, their role in the play, and the exact nature and the extent of their evil. In this play, these ambiguous creatures are portrayed as having familiars, in the sense that they have the cat Grimalkin and the toad Paddock. They themselves admit to killing swine, they sail in sieves, they control winds, which all imply that they might have a pact with the devil. However, if we pay attention to all of their three prophecies, to Macbeth and Banquo, we understand that they are equivocal in prophecy. That is, they are not dishonest, yet deceiving. We cannot but agree with Diane Purvis when she says, the play ultimately reconfigures all charming as deceptive. The witches have not really charmed or stained or saved Macbeth. They have tricked him into thinking he is invincible when he is not. They have flattered him, and he has believed their lies because he wants to. Firstly, Macbeth does not know that he has already been made the Thane of Order from being the Thane of Glamis, which the audience does. So that hardly counts as a prophecy. Then he interprets the witch's predictions that he can't be defeated until Birnam Wood moves, and that he can't be killed except by a man not born of woman, as proof that he is protected. He is very wrong, as he does not take into account that the moving of a wood can result of a military tactic, where the soldiers carry leafy branches in front of them as a camouflage before attacking Macbeth's castle. He also never for once imagines that not of woman born can imply a man born of caesarean section. It is striking that the prophecies of the witches that Macbeth takes solace from are based on disorder in the world of the play. The concept of the wood moving and a man not of woman born appearing. Yet, the disorder that Macbeth does not expect or imagine is the disorder he gets in the form of the military tricks and equivocation, which ultimately defeats him. Ambivalence continues as we see that these witches report to Hecate, who is a Greco-Roman goddess, a deity hence a mythological being. There is a long standing debate on the role of the witches in the events and the tragedy that unfold in the play, the question of fate versus personal responsibility, and the consequences of ambition in the ruling class. I would like to remind the audience that Macbeth clearly says in Act 1, Scene 3, after he learns that he has been made the Thane of Cawdor and is contemplating on the prophecies of the witches, why do I yield to that suggestion, whose horrid image doth unfix my hair and make my seated heart knock at my ribs against the use of nature? Present fears are less than horrible imaginings. My thought, whose murder yet is but fantastical, shakes so my single state of man, that function is mothered in surmise, and nothing is but what is not. If chance will have me king, why, chance may crown me without my stir. These are significant lines and shows Macbeth is aware that he does not need to act to realize the prophecies. Yet the use of the subjunctive may, chance may crown me without my stir, also contains the suggestion that he may not leave his future to chance or fate, and that this is where his ambition roots and where the seed of his downfall lies buried deep. This is one reason why I object to scapegoating both the witches and Lady Macbeth for Macbeth's numerous crimes, one after the other, leading to his tragic downfall and death. He may have been pushed into action by the temptation provided by the witches and the instigation of Lady Macbeth, respectively. But the seeds of ambition lay deep within him, which initially stirred him into wanting to commit regicide. The above speech is long before he first meets Lady Macbeth in Act 1, Scene 5. Moreover, we should never forget that both Banquo and Macbeth heard the prophecies that Macbeth would be made king and Banquo's sons would be future kings, and they individually choose how to react and act, either fairly or foully, keeping or breaking the order in the world of the play. As Macbeth himself knows, and we shouldn't forget, this supernatural soliciting cannot be ill, cannot be good. Finally, let's sum up about Shakespeare's ambivalent use of witchcraft in Macbeth. We have already seen that the historicity of witchcraft movement has direct bearing on the creation of Shakespeare's Macbeth and the Weird Sisters. However, Shakespeare does not endorse notions of continental pact witchcraft central to demonology, as the witches are not presented as outrightly evil. Moreover, although the witches pose the problem and incite the protagonist to action in the play, are they actually themselves scapegoat figures who then scapegoat Macbeth? The question remains as to why they are given such prominence in a tragedy designed to perform before the king and the court. We cannot forget that the existence of witchcraft was recognized by English law. An Act of 1604 made the practice of it punishable by death. But it was not unquestioned. Reginald Scott, as we have seen, had attacked popular beliefs in his discovery of witchcraft, asserting that the alleged cases of witchcraft were often fraudulent or the result of neurotic delusions. In 1603, Dr. Edward Jordan described in a brief discourse of a disease called suffocation of the mother how delusions of demonic possession could be produced by hysteria or the mother, which often women were said to suffer from. There was also considerable interest in the power of imagination to create such effects. Shakespeare was certainly familiar with Montaigne's essay on the force of the imagination, published in Fleurier's translation of the essays in 1603. And what we see is that Shakespeare portrayed both witchcraft as well as the hallucinatory power of imagination in Macbeth. At least, we can say that the witches are for real. Macbeth and Banquo both encounter them and converse with them and receive answers to their questions, however misleading these answers may be. This is unlike the two other supernatural events in the play that can be categorized as resulting from Macbeth's heat-oppressed brain or prick of conscience or hallucinatory power of imagination. These are the dagger scenes and the scenes where Macbeth sees Banquo's ghost in the banquet. When he sees the dagger floating in front of him and leading him to Duncan's bedroom, we wonder whether the dagger is supernatural or an hallucination. Is it, as he says, a dagger of the mind, a false creation, proceeding from the heat-oppressed brain? Seeing the dagger could just be his imagination, or it could also be the work of the supernatural, as it does seem to urge him towards Duncan's bedroom to commit the murder. Then, the scene of Banquo's ghost in Act 3, Scene 4, where the ghost is seen only by Macbeth during banquet. Yet, Banquo's ghost is mentioned in the stage directions and it torments guilty Macbeth, who has killed him. Again, is it a vengeful spirit? Is it a demon? Or is it a psychological projection of a guilty mind? Simon Forman, in his personal account of the play he had watched in 1611, mentioned seeing Banquo's ghost. So, we can say that the ghost was staged even in the first performance. Yet critics such as Kenneth Moore say that the ghost is clearly an hallucination. Jonathan Bate too asserts that the ghost is a figment of the guilty conscience of Macbeth. Martin Pavel suggests that the ghost being seen by all would lead to an instant revelation and general awareness of the murder, and that is obviously not in order at this point, because of which he claims that the others cannot see the ghost and it is only Banquo who sees, because they are not aware yet that Banquo is no more. It is morally appropriate, he continues, that the ghost arrives when Macbeth is being hypocritical about his friendship with Banquo and speaks of missing his presence, which would be a combination of poetic justice and dramatic irony. Macbeth, after murdering Duncan, feels he has murdered sleep, and the appearance of Banquo's ghost, the mental collapse of Lady Macbeth, that she is unable to wash off the blood on her hands, are all manifestations of disorder in the human world, caused by the supreme violation of the natural order of the divine rule of kings, caused by Macbeth's regicide, and there is no way Macbeth and Lady Macbeth can escape the consequences. So finally, how supernatural is Macbeth? We have seen that the play does begin with the witches, because of which the setting becomes otherworldly. Witches are shown to have conventional attributes of continental and English witch lore. Yet, the question remains is that what do they actually do? Stephen Greenblatt points out that Macbeth questions its own representation of witchcraft. It stages the dilemmas that haunted the attempts to determine the status of witchcraft beliefs and practices. Shakespeare leaves the witches unpunished, yet implicates them in a monstrous threat to the fabric of civilized life. According to Greenblatt, what happens in the play is the bleeding of the demonic into secular and vice versa. Their prophecies lead to disenchantment, and Macbeth finally understands the prophecies to be equivocations, although by then it is too late. And he says, "And be these juggling fiends no more believed, that palter with us in a double sense, that keep the word of promise to our ear and break it to our hope." We are left with the question, did Shakespeare deliberately engage in equivocation on the issue of witchcraft? I would say yes, as he never provides a single discourse as the answer to the representation of witchcraft. He refuses any direct solution and insists that the menace and pleasure of witchcraft as a spectacle lies in its destabilizing inscrutability. The fusion of Macbeth of these two attitudes to demonology, the superstitious and the skeptical, enables it to combine a vivid external presentation of the forces of evil with a profound exploration of their psychological sources and the effects in the human mind, blurring the lines between the fair and the foul, and reinforces how the supernatural cannot be held solely responsible for Macbeth's actions and scapegoated as causing the disorder in this play and being the sole reason behind Macbeth's tragic downfall. So these are my sources, and thank you for listening so patiently.
Thank you, Paramita. At the outset, I would like to congratulate you for this wonderful presentation. Words of appreciation are pouring. I can see the YouTube channel also. Your energy level and your oration, this needs to be appreciated right at the beginning. And I must say here that Paromita is also a dramaturge. No doubt she chose this play. It's also very close to my heart because we put up a small performance on this, and you are close to theatre, so you will understand. And the way Paromita presented this paper and the slides, I'm sure already questions are pouring in. It has, opened up a lot of avenues and people are asking questions because you have very pertinently pointed out a lot of things, especially the historical part. A lot of things to ponder on. Thank you, Paramita. And now I would invite my colleague Ashish Vishwas once again to take over the question answer session because a lot needs to be discussed with students. Over to Ashish. Ashish, where are you? I think there are net issues. Wait for a few seconds. Today I must tell you, Parvita, it has been raining and the weather has been cloudy here. So there are network issues and I can see the sun behind you, right? Morning.
Morning for us. 11 o'clock right now.
Madhu, can I say something? This is Rabustidi.
Yes, please.
Since the questions are in the chat box, if our speaker ma'am could take the questions herself, then I think we should be comfortable and we can save some time as well.
Yes, Paromita, could you take up the questions yourself or you want me to read them out?
I think I can take them myself. Thank you so much. Okay, so I'll just open the chat box. If you could give me a moment. Yes. So I think the first question is from Smriti Banerjee, who says that can it be considered that Shakespeare used the idea of transgenders as witches because that time it must be something which people often won't accept in society. So I think that's a fantastic question, Smriti, and it's extremely relevant now. And as I've been trying to say throughout my paper, that what Shakespeare is doing is basically, and that's what I ended with, he's not giving any personal stand. And that's what he does in all his plays, I think, because he leaves it completely open to interpretation. But obviously, when he is creating creatures who have a lot of ambiguity in their appearance and gender, we today, from our point of view, can obviously consider them to be transgenders, and again that would represent the disorder in the play, right? And we would again demonize them because, as it happens now, whoever is in the majority forms the other, whoever is in the minority is thought to be disordered. So I don't know if that answers your questions, but that's my take. So I really cannot comment on what Shakespeare did, but this is a feasible interpretation because they would obviously occupy that liminal space. So next question is that you're talking about the Salins witch trial has a connection with this play against Smriti Banerjee. The Salins witch trial was in colonial Massachusetts in the 16th century. So obviously these are similar witch trials which are happening everywhere, and I have spoken about Scotland in England and in Europe. And there was one of the witch trials that have actually been said to, was this North Berwick trial, because related to King James. And then there was a Lancashire witch trial happening in the same time, which has said that may have influenced Shakespeare's representation of the witches. So when you say Barnali Borua has this question, does this sentence, fair is foul and foul is fair, have any political aspect? Is it trying to show the duplicity of the administrative persons? This is actually a very, very interesting perspective, Barnali. And this can be very valid. And if you know that there was the gunpowder plot in 1605, which was trying to, they were trying to blow the parliament, the Catholics, and James was totally against the Catholics, and he had arrested Henry Garnet, who was solely responsible, who was the mind behind the gunpowder plot, and he had committed perjury in court. He had lied, and he had lied in the name of God, and that's what he had said, that he couldn't be accused of perjury because he was equivocating. He was lying in the name of God. So when even the Porter scene where he talks about the equivocator, there's this mention of Henry Garnet. So this play does have a lot of political resonances of those times. So it can be that because again, it depends on perspective, and Shakespeare keeps this extremely fluid. What I've tried to show throughout my discussion, that it can be that he's commenting on the rules of and the administration of those times. So does the term which put on them to decrease women's position supernaturalism or some kind of power to predict future or foresighted related to women is a threat to the then society? Thank you, Papri, for this question. I think that's what I was trying to tell you, that witches were actually mortal women who were said to have supernatural powers, and as I showed, in those times, mostly midwives who had absolutely, and I have read a lot of accounts, historical accounts of these witches, where most of them were absolutely helpless, and if they were, they occupied the marginal spaces in the society, and if they lived independently or singly, then they were considered a threat, and they were labeled as witches. And how to discover they were witches was to try and kill them. If they died, then they were not witches. And if they were alive, obviously they were witches and had to be executed. So ultimately, they would be killed. I mean, that was the bottom line. So obviously, and I have read stories like, if you read Antonia Fraser, and because she writes very engagingly it's you can read that, The Weaker Vessel, where there are stories of a woman who, is having a fight with her neighbor over something, and she cursed him, and the next day the neighbor, maybe one of his animals in the farm, died. So he immediately labeled her as a witch because she had cursed him, his animal had died, and then there would be a witch trial. So you read these numerous accounts. If you delve into the historical texts of this period and secondary sources, you will get numerous accounts such as these, where you realize that they were actually scapegoated in being witches, and some of them often had delusions because something had happened. So I talk about these delusions, and this Reginald Scott too mentions, he says these allegations of witchcraft are completely fraudulent. And James I opposes that because he firmly believes in these witches. What could be the three fates Macbeth would have had if they were not witch sisters telling prophecies? I'm not very sure I answered these questions. I understand the question exactly. From what I understand, I think I've been talking about the three fates, and we know the three fates from the Greek mythology, who are spinning the wheel and who are determining, the fate of a man and his trajectory in life. And when they cut the spinning wheel is the time and the man dies. So it's not that they will give him three wishes or three fates. The fates are represented as three women. That's why they are called the three fates. And my contention throughout the paper has been that the seed of ambition was in Macbeth all through. It may have been fanned by external circumstances, but it was not something that was actually, given, it's not that he was completely a pure, innocent soul, and then he suddenly became evil and decided to go on a killing spree because of the witches and Macbeth. And that's why I discussed those two scenes in Act 1, Scene 3, and his own dialogues, where he says the chance needs to me that why should I need to act? And Banquo does not act. And he doesn't even meet Lady Macbeth. Of course, she's a very strong influence. She moves him into taking the strong decision and acting on his purposes. But the purpose is there. So that's what I've been saying. So Om Singh Can we say it's Lady Macbeth who plays a more vital role in Macbeth's damnation than the witches? Because after the prophecies by the witches, Macbeth was still in a dilemma, but it was Lady Macbeth who carved the path of Macbeth's damnation throughout her manipulation. Of course, I think Lady Macbeth play a very vital role in prodding him and making him take the final step. That is absolutely true. Because as you say yourself, and as we really agree that he was in a dilemma. But again, I would definitely not scapegoat her into. She is obviously a very, very powerful and a very, again, she occupies a liminal space because she's not like the normal women who are very submissive wives in those periods. That's what we expect from the Queen in these times. She's not. She tells him like what his roles are, what his duties are. She's not feminine enough. She says that she wants the supernatural powers to crown her and to give her those, what we consider to be masculine qualities. She doesn't have the, she wants to hit her child, unborn child. She would have killed her unborn child, and she thinks that Macbeth has too much of the milk of human kindness. So she is occupying a space which is not normal in those times at all. As a woman, she is expected to be very submissive. In those times, she is expected to just toe the line of Macbeth and not direct him. So she is a very, very unique creation, I would say, because she has so much of independent thought. She has so much of power, and she prods and she pushes her husband, which is not expected. And the husband is obviously kind of instigated by her and does take certain actions, but the seeds of those actions were already there in him. He was the one who had sent the letter to Lady Macbeth. He was the one who was thinking on these things. So I would consider her to be a very important influence, yes, but I wouldn't scapegoat her. Mohar Sen says the sounds of supernatural soliciting in Macbeth. So I suppose this is a comment and not a question. And Nishidi says, was Shakespeare subverting the presentation of the witches? He was paying homage to James I's demonology and the general interest in witchcraft at the time. Yes, I do think that is one of the main causes, because that's what I've tried to show. Nishidi, thank you for the question, because he's not subverting. He's not taking any one path. Okay, because just like James I was opposed witches. Before him, Reginald Scott said that all these allegations of witchcraft were fraudulent, and these were poor women who were being victimized. And James I opposed that. Okay, and he was writing a play which was being performed the first time in Hampton Court in front of King James I, and obviously had to please. So we have this pageant of 8 kings, and where Banquo's line, and the last 9th king is supposed to be King James, and this is during the apparition which is shown in Act 4. And it is said that in the first performance, the apparition, the last one, actually showed a mirror and pointed that mirror to King James, who was attending the performance, to kind of give that homage to him, that he is that 9th Stuart king, because they were trying to establish the Stuart line after Queen Elizabeth I's death as the divinely appointed rulers of Britain. So the death of Elizabeth Tudor and the beginning of Stuart. So it is a very, very political time and a very politically sensitive time, and obviously Shakespeare was doing that, and he was, where I think he's actually subverting is where he is making Macbeth the tyrant at the end. And when Malcolm and Macduff are planning to depose Macbeth and kill him, they don't ever discuss the issue that he had killed King Duncan, whether he had done the correct thing by usurping the throne. He's only mentioned as the tyrant. But if we go by King James's views of the divine rule of kings, which he had also written, King James had written the Basilican Doron, okay, where he had mentioned this divine rule of kings. So then deposing any ruler, even if he's a tyrant, would be wrong. But when Malcolm and Macduff are thinking about that and deposing ultimately and killing Macbeth, we don't have any comment from Shakespeare on this. And this is again being, so if I look at only King James I's ideology, this too is as wrong as killing King Duncan. because the ruler is always divinely appointed. You cannot remove him. You're disturbing the natural order then. Okay, so thank you those who have enjoyed my presentation. Mohar Sen has asked, how does Shakespeare present the witches here? I really cannot answer that again, because then I would have to speak again for 30 minutes and repeat my entire presentation. So can we say, Sriti Banerjee ma'am, can we say that fair is foul, foul is fair, has a connection with Lady Macbeth? Yes, you may say that, because not in the statement that I'm using, but again, because she's, as I said, a very, very unusual woman of those times. And she occupies a completely marginal space, because she's not like the common early modern woman who's just supposed to be a chattel of the husband and not have any say in any matter. Okay, so she occupies that space where she's so masculine. She seems so unpleasant when she's talking. You kind of recoil in horror at her aggressiveness. So obviously that is there. At the same time, she says that she cannot murder Duncan because she sees like a father figure in him. So it is fair is foul and foul is fair. And she's the one who disintegrates completely later because she can't accept the burden of guilt. Shatvik Gupta said, what are your thoughts on the character development of Lady Macbeth? Also, do you think, was it regret that killed her? I do think it is a lot of guilt. Yes, it is a lot of guilt. And it all added up, which led to the mental collapse. And it's really, if you see the scene where I talk up the Banquo's ghost and where Macbeth plans murdering Banquo, it's from that scene onwards where Lady Macbeth actually goes in the background. And it's and Macbeth then comes on the top, and he's taking the reins of the entire. And he even says pretty kind of diminutive terms to her, that don't worry, Chuck, I'm taking. He uses the term Chuck for her, because now he's kind of on his own, and he takes all the decisions, and he leaves her out. So till then they were like partners together in crime, but from then on she kind of disintegrates, and she kind of becomes totally burdened by her guilt. Can you call Lady Macbeth a fourth witch? Okay, that is obviously a common interpretation in criticism. I choose not to call her that, personally. Okay. Shravasti Chattopadhyay has asked, is not Banquo the Machiavellian character here? The actual fair is foul. He ensures his future by checking out Macbeth's fate as declared by the witches. So is disorder not part of order? Well, I would beg to differ a bit, because he's not really Machiavellian at all. And because he doesn't really commit any evil for anything. And he just he's very curious when he asks Macbeth, when he asks the witches, initially, because they are prophesying about Macbeth, he says, don't you have, because they are initially a little skeptical. And this is what I've talked about. There's a lot of skepticism about the witches too. So he asks them that you have said so many things, and he sees the effect that's having on Macbeth. And he says that we have so many prophecies for Macbeth. So don't you have any for me? And then he hears that his future sons he will never be king, but his future sons will be king. So I will not say that he's ensuring his future in any way, because he does nothing. And that's what I point out in my lecture, that they both hear the prophecies and they both choose to react and act. And Banquo actually does nothing. And it's Macbeth who tries to kill him, and Fleance. His main purpose is killing Fleance, because Fleance would be continuing the line. And again, maybe it's fate, because that's the way it's supposed to be, that Banquo dies, but Fleance escapes. And so the line of kings, Banquo's line of kings remains. So, Lady Macbeth is also called the fourth witch. Yes, Madhu Srivastava has asked me that, and what is your take on that? I have, as I said, this is a very common kind of allegation of Lady Macbeth. In my reading, obviously, I think she's a very, very uncommon, aggressive woman, because I have studied a lot on even marriage and Renaissance drama, on which was my PhD thesis, and I've looked at the conditions of women, of marriage, of what the wives were supposed to be. And if I place her in that context that Shakespeare has created, she's completely different. She's absolutely unique. She's aggressive. She's, as we say, kind of disordered. she would be called a disordered woman in those times, because she's trying to actually, dominate her husband, which is unthinkable. Okay, but I would not say that she is. I would not consider her to be a fourth witch, because whenever we do that, we are scapegoating her and saying that actually, Macbeth was so innocent, and he was just led into murdering King Duncan, and poor Macbeth. And I don't want to trivialize the situation, but when I read about what's happening in India now and the way you're witch hunting Rhea Chakraborty for Sushant Singh's suicide, I mean, it just reminds me that this is something that we have to stop doing at some point. Okay. So Nivedita Chakraborty has asked me, would you say that most of Shakespeare's heroines had a stronger, different personality than women of that period? I think that's a very, very valid question, very interesting and very pertinent question, because they do. And that's why Shakespeare's heroines and Shakespeare's women are so fascinating. Be it Rosalind in As You Like It, be it Helena in All's Well That Ends Well, be it Portia in Merchant of Venice, be it Lady Macbeth in Macbeth. I mean, you just have them as personalities. You don't have them as stereotypes. And that is something amazing. Charmier Kare has asked me, unsex me here, what is your take on this quotation from Macbeth in relation to Lady Macbeth's sexuality? Again, this is the same place where she is. Thank you, Chanika, for pointing this out. And this is the same place where she's, wanting the powers to kind of occupy her, and she's being so aggressive. So this is something, again, sexuality was a very, very kind of fluid and troubled aspect, because, it was supposed to control a man through sexuality, and even the devils, when the witches were supposed to control people through their sexuality. If you remember in Act 1, Scene 3, the witch says, about the sailor, and ends with, I'll do, I'll do, I'll do. So I'll do is a euphemism for the sexual intercourse. Okay, and then this too, and the devil, when I talked about the birthmarks in women, which is thought to be as devil's mark, what was the devil's mark? It was thought to be like, if you had a birthmark, they were often considered to be devil's mark. What was the devil's mark? The women were supposed to have had intercourse with the devil, who had licked their private parts, which left a mark. So sexuality is a very, very important construct in this road of creating witches, and in this relation between man and woman. And this obviously, when this shows her aggressiveness, this shows how different she is, and from the women of her period. And this is, again, I would say that it does reflect on her sexuality and her sexual maybe allurance. It may have. Thank you. Smriti Banerjee has also asked, ma'am, on a different note, why it's 3 witches? Does this carry in significance? I think 3 is a number, a significant number, and maybe it's related to the 3 fates, because the fates were represented as 3 women. So we have this question of personal responsibility versus fate all throughout the movie. Okay? So thank you for this. I think we don't have any more questions.
There is another question, Madhu, on YouTube. I've just sent it to you.
I have already noted it. Paramita, do you want me to read? There's a question on YouTube, and I think it's a good question. Someone, Shubhita Pal asks, do you think Shakespeare tried to demonize ambition through a dramatization of Macbeth as a serial killer in modern times, instead of perceiving ambition as aspirational for lower classes?
Thank you for the question, Professor Shubhita Pal. And I think that, can you hear me?
Yeah, now. Yeah.
So basically, I wouldn't say that, first of all, Macbeth himself is a kinsman, and I wouldn't call him to be like just lower classes and demonizing ambition. I do not agree with that. But I think what you're trying to say, I'm not saying is demonizing ambition. I would just try to say the consequences of excessive ambition. I would say it's just the consequences of excessive ambition which leads you to try and, not achieve but overachieve. I don't know if that answers the question. Could you just repeat the question once again?
Yeah. Question goes this way. Do you think Shakespeare tried to demonize ambition through the dramatization of Macbeth as a serial killer in modern times, instead of perceiving ambition as aspirational for lower classes?
No, I don't think that he is. First of all, I don't think that Macbeth is being shown as, like, we can really call him like a serial killer, because what we see is actually the disintegration of a noble man who is in the grips of ambition. When the scene opens, we hear of his valor, we hear of his strength, we hear of his different achievements. So he is of a ruling class, and if actually, I mean, if we look at the tanistry laws in Scotland in those times, if actually he could have been the king, it's because if you look at Raphael Holinshed's chronicles, you will see that this was at that time the historical chronicle says that he could have ruled easily, and Duncan was going actually a step. He was taking a different step by nominating Malcolm as his next ruler, because in that time in Scotland there was no primogeniture, but there was tanistry, where an elected person from the kinsmen, noble kinsmen, who had proved their valor in any way, could be made king. And Macbeth fitted the bill perfectly. So Shakespeare is actually doing a lot of things which is not there exactly in the chronicles. He's giving his own take, and he is showing what obviously happens when there is, as I said, over ambition, which leads to overachieving. But I will not reduce Macbeth to just a serial killer, because we identify with him throughout. We are sympathetic towards him throughout. We are with him through his fall, through his tragic downfall. And we feel sorry for him till towards the end. And that is what it makes it such a beautiful tragedy. We can't just label him as a serial killer.
Well, with this, we come to the end of the question answer session. There are no more questions. Thank you, Paramita. Thanks a lot. On behalf of both the colleges, Maharivananda Mahavidyalaya and Bamunpur Humayun Kabir Mahavidyalaya, I thank both our speakers, Dr. Nishi Kulagurtha and Dr. Paramita Dotto, for this, extremely erudite and engaging session. Our participants have enjoyed a lot. We can see because of the questions and the discussions. And I take the privilege and honor also to thank our principals, Mahadevanand Mahavidyalaya, and principal of our college, Dr. Subhash Vishwas, the technical team, without whose cooperation, this webinar would not have been possible at all. With this, we come to the end of the second day of international webinar on order and disorder, negotiating Shakespeare. And we have yet another day of discussion. We are all looking forward to it. And once more, I thank all the participants, without whom this webinar would have been meaningless. Thank you for your patient hearing. And once again, thanks to all the members of the organizing committee of both the colleges. It was really very nice to be here. And I would just mention that this whole webinar happened because of Paramita. She's an exception of this, that's true. So once again, a thank you to you. And I believe we have all enjoyed this thoroughly. Once again, revisiting the text we have read at some point of time when we teach, but a lot lies ahead, I believe. And yet another day of discussion on this topic. So with this, we come to the end of the webinar. Good evening. Be safe, all of you, wherever you are. And that's it. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
So
Bye,
much.
Nishi.
Bye.
Bye, Paramita. Modi.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye, Nishide.
Bye,
See you sometime.
Shabashri. Thank
Thank you
you.
so much,
Thank
Dr.
you. Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you so much, Paramita and Nishidi
Thank
and
you. Thank you,
everybody.
Nishidi,
Thank you, Madhu.
Thank
Paramita.
you.
Thank you, Shanika. Thank you, Shravusiti.
Thank you, Madhu.
Thank you, Madhu.
We
Thank
thoroughly
you. Thank
enjoyed. Okay,
you.
we
So nice
thoroughly
to see
enjoyed.
you, Paramita, after such a long time. You remember the discussion we found how it started? Really was.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Yeah,
See you
খুব
soon.
ভালো লাগলো থ্যাংক
how
ইউ
would it happen, So many things have come together because of that.
ইয়েস
Thank you.